We'll dive straight into the final portion of the 1990 article in the local Vestnik Chernobyl, written by Chernobyl liquidators and workers, to see if we can set a record on the percentage of viewers lost in the first minute of a video. The sixth and final principal violation allegation made against the Chernobyl Unit 4 operators by Soviet nuclear power experts was the disabling of the emergency core coolant system, usually seen abbreviated as SAOR in Russian sources, which is indeed the pre-translation abbreviation seen in this text, or ECCS in English sources. The listed consequence for this violation was the somewhat curiously worded loss of the opportunity/possibility to reduce the scale of the accident. This particular protection system targeted a maximum design basis accident, where a large supply pipe would rupture and fuel channels would be empty of coolant after 2 seconds. This emergency core cooling system was always in standby mode and independent of reactor operation, so that it could activate whenever there were signs of large diameter pipeline ruptures. One downside of it was that it supplied cold water relative to the normally circulating water, which could lead to additional ruptures due to hydraulic shocks and unacceptable rate of metal cooling. Naturally, false activation of this system concerned operators. If you look at the listed motivation of why this system was disabled at the time of the Chernobyl disaster, you see it is a desire to avoid the false activation of this system and potential damage. It is one thing when a large diameter pipeline ruptures, and it is necessary to save the fuel from meltdown with cold water, and something quite different when this system triggers unnecessarily and causes damage itself. The article authors then discuss how for this reason full checks of the emergency core cooling system were performed only on stopped and cooled down reactors, but apparently partial checks of the system on individual units of it were mandated on operating reactors, without cold water entering the core cooling circuit. This entailed taking the particular unit tested out of the emergency standby mode. Operating instructions did not define for how long this partial disabling was permitted. Strangely, the article authors mention a second related system that was never disabled at the time of the Chernobyl disaster, ambiguously combined with the emergency core cooling system in operating instructions, but in the following paragraph they concede a violation occurred. So, on the night of the 25th and 26th of April 1986, it was strictly speaking necessary to disable one of the 3 channels of the emergency core cooling system to perform the rundown test. However, due to fear of false triggering of the remainder of the system and the short duration of the testing program, the chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Nikolai Fomin, signed off on disabling the emergency core cooling system altogether. This was apparently a violation, but to what extent was the safety of Reactor 4 affected? And what role did the disabling of this protection system play in the Chernobyl disaster? Well, it turns out that the nerds involved with nuclear reactors had calculated the possibility of a large diameter pipeline rupture, however accurately or inaccurately, according to data from the chief designer, presumably the Institute Nikiat. This probability was 2.2 times 10 to the minus 7, or 0.000000022. The article authors tell us that, as we can see, this is a very small number, which is why updated regulations written in 1988 moved the event triggering the emergency core cooling system from maximum design basis accident to a beyond design basis accident. Taking into account the expected duration of the ECCS being disabled for the Chernobyl 1986 testing program, the chance for the ECCS to have been needed was more along the lines of 1 times 10 to the minus 10. The ECCS ended up being disconnected for 12 hours, making the chance 3 times 10 to the power of minus 10. To put these values into context, the article authors point to another scenario with a comparable chance of occurring being considered by the chief designer as practically impossible and thus not warranting a protection system altogether. Then the article authors proceed to argue that the disconnection of the ECCS did not make a difference to the circumstances of Chernobyl in particular. From what we can tell, the most important part of this paragraph, that we can cross-reference with other sources, is that the triggering signal for this system never occurred, and along with the reactor, it was blown to bits. For those who believe that our entire approach seems to be reading things a small number of people said and expecting the narrative we're trying to sell magically appearing out of thin air, a la lots of spice but no steak, let us turn once more to INSAG 7, the international report on the Chernobyl accident that serves as the top source on the topic of causes. The first international section of INSAG 7 comments on this alleged violation on page 10. The authors write that the disconnection was no violation and was an approved step of the testing program. They also write that the system not being enabled did not affect the initiation and development of the incident. They take issue with the extended duration of this disconnection and claim this was indicative of an absence of safety culture. More on this a little later. In our experience with the report, we have found indications of an absence of reading comprehension among the international authors, so we do a double check by flipping to the bottom of page 72 and the top of page 73 for what Annex 1 writes on this matter. What Annex 1 highlights is an apparent contradiction in the operating instructions. One place states the ECCS must be on, another that it can be turned off with the involvement of the chief engineer, who, let's remember, signed off on turning off the system. Well, therefore, there was a violation of the place stating that the ECCS must be on. We can call that a diplomatic violation. But, secondly, for the third time, we see a statement that switching off the ECCS did not affect the initiation and development of the incident, since no signals for the triggering of the system were recorded. Therefore, under the specific conditions of the Chernobyl disaster, it is not true to state that an opportunity of reducing the severity of the incident was lost because the ECCS was switched off, which is what Soviet experts in 1986 put down on paper. Even the 1986 INSAG 1 report gave limited credence to the role of the disabling of the emergency core cooling system. At 2 p.m. on the INSAG 1 timeline, it is stated that the blocked ECCS played no role in transient to point of core disruption. It may somehow have been useful, in its blown-up state, in the so-called post-disruption period. Or, as page 23 of the report puts the extended disconnection, although subsequent events were not greatly affected by this, the fact that the ECCS was not reset reflects the attitude of the operating staff with regard to the violation of normal procedures. Apparently by the end of the table listing the most dangerous violations of the operating rules committed by the staff of the 4th unit of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Soviet nuclear power experts were running out of steam to the point of including attitude problems of the 10 to the negative 10th power. Let's finish our review of the 6th false allegation against the operators with some operator perspective. Igor Kazachkov, the morning Unit 4 shift supervisor under whom the ECCS was disconnected, stated that the only deviation in the testing program from the operating instructions was the disconnection of this system. He doesn't comment on the disconnection being approved by the chief engineer. He brings up the extreme unlikelihood of a rupture of a large diameter pipeline in the time period. Whether this course of action signifies a lack of safety culture ultimately comes down to the context of what exactly the chief engineer was allowed to permit according to the instructions. If the operating instructions were literally contradictory, the focus should hardly be on the safety culture of operators, as they were inheriting an attitude problem from up high. Perhaps this was one of, if not the biggest flaw of the Soviet system in the context of Chernobyl. As our Kurchatov Institute viewer attests, the subject matter experts themselves were reckless. Did pressure and complacency producing such recklessness come from higher up still? Maybe. But according to our Kurchatov viewer, Specialists were lying to the government regarding the safety of their work. And we see in Politburo notes the government regretting the independence of the nuclear industry. But many of these socialist systems were like this. Silly demands and silly fulfillments of them. Anyway, Kazachkov then remarks on how the disconnection of the ECCS was blown out of proportion. Quote, and then the entire press said, and abroad, I read the Americans talked about this accident, that the explosion allegedly occurred because the Russians disabled the safety system. But I assert there was no connection between this explosion and the disablement of the backup cooling system. And there is none. And about I said this in court when I was a witness. I don't remember who, the prosecutor or the judge asked, did the safety system's shutdown affect the course of the explosion? I answered no. The same question was asked to the experts, and the experts gave the same answer. End quote. Yuri Tregub, the supervisor of the following shift, explained why he extended the duration of the disconnection of this system. The emergency cooling system of the reactor began to be withdrawn during the Kazachkov shift. This is a very big job. After all, we have manual valves. Just imagine, one valve takes about 45 minutes. A valve is like a steering wheel on a sailboat, only a little smaller and stands horizontally. To close it, it requires the efforts of 2 people, or better yet, 3. It's all done manually. It took Kazachkov almost his entire shift to put the emergency system out of operation. This is very hard work. How long would it take me to bring it back on? I wouldn't bring it back on. What if I had to take it off again for testing? By the way, as the accident showed, the SAOR wouldn't have done anything anyway, because all the connectors came off, everything came off, all the valves at once. The article authors wanted to bring up one last thing. The turbo generator rundown that was being tested at Chernobyl, and nowhere else, was meant to enhance the safety of all RBMK reactors in the event of the maximum design basis accident with a nuclear power plant blackout. Without this turbo generator rundown being successfully implemented, according to the regulations, RBMK power plants were apparently not supposed to run above 50% power. But they were of course run so. In updated regulations after the Chernobyl disaster, the maximum design basis accident was reclassified as beyond design basis accident, and thus the matter could be moved on from. It would appear the alleged attitude of operators was not an indication of an absence of safety culture, but merely an indication of the future. The more you look into Chernobyl, the weirder it gets. One specific sentence in this paragraph caught our eye as related to something we've read in Politburo session notes. The one about the first stages, comprised of earlier reactors, of some RBMK nuclear power plants being exceptionally deficient, apparently practically lacking an emergency core cooling system. In July of 1986 Politburo session notes, the Deputy Minister of Energy responsible for nuclear power, Gennady Shasharin, an ironically junior official to members of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, speaks of how the first stages of various RBMK power plants will have to be shut down, beyond the fixes that could be applied to the other reactor units. Those earlier units were not shut down. When it came to the Chernobyl operators relative to the nuclear power experts, which could be put in quotation marks, above them it was extreme safety culture for thee, not for me. Throw in so many lies that you lose count, and it's almost no surprise Chernobyl is so misunderstood despite the information just lying there. ChatGPT can't sort it out either, despite how much water and power it guzzles, which may be what prevents it from initiating Skynet. Finally, it's time to summarise. The article authors offer the following 3 actual operating violations. 1. There were individual main circulation pumps that had excessive flow rates. These individual MCP flow rate limits were set to prevent cavitation resulting in pump breakdown. Cavitation did not occur. The actual problem, as listed under the consequences column of the violation table Soviet experts provided, was the coolant being close to its boiling point. According to INSAG 7, the relevant mechanism for this is that paradoxically the RBMK reactor relied on steam production to form the cooler feed water component that subcooled water circulating through the reactor core. Steam would pass through the turbines and be condensed into water at a lower temperature than the liquid being directly recirculated, mixing with it and reducing its temperature. Thus, a lack of steam generation due to the extra water going through the reactor, with all main circulation pumps being connected, 8 rather than the usual 6, resulted in the coolant's temperature being close to its boiling point due to a lack of subcooling feed water. Setting aside the fact that operators were somehow able to increase the feed water flow rate by multiples, and that leading up to the safety test the feed water flow rate was brought down to average values, neither the connection of the extra main circulation pumps, nor the total reactor flow rate, nor the temperature of the coolant being close to its boiling point were violations. As we discussed in the False Narrative 2 video, this was the Soviet bundle of deception that packaged one violation without consequence with a non-violation, or a number of non-violations if you will, that potentially had consequence to portray the operators as guilty for the disaster. We say that potentially had consequence because we also learned that RBMK reactors could normally have their coolant close to its boiling point, hence why this state was even mentioned in operating instructions. It turns out that the last people who should have been trusted on what the RBMK operating instructions actually contained were Soviet nuclear power experts after a Soviet nuclear power disaster. Imagine that. The second actual violation was the water in the steam separator drums, emergency set point not being switched from -1100mm to -600mm. We discussed this matter in the previous video of the series. The RBMK designers did not automate this switch because they explicitly did not want the reactor to be shut down, thereby rendering RBMK operators manually controlling emergency fluctuations to keep reactors running normal operating practice. The water level in the steam separator drums was gotten under control in time for the rundown test and had nothing to do with the disaster. Lastly, the third actual violation, again without a practical consequence, was the complete disconnection of the emergency core cooling system, again in a context of contradictory operating instructions. If we look at page 78 of INSAG 7, we see these same 3 actual violations listed, except Annex 1 of INSAG 7 also lists an operating reactivity margin of under 15 rods violation. We have discussed the ORM matter in many videos, notably in the Control and Protection System and the False Narrative 1 videos of this series, and in the Unanswered Questions video on what the actual ORM value was when it mattered. Setting aside the twisting of this parameter, which INSAG 7 shamefully partakes in, a case can be made against listing it due to its commonly known value of 6 to 8 rods being cherry-picked. This was a transient value that necessarily went up as the feed water flow was reduced, and then as the total flow was reduced during the test, causing the insertion of control rods. Among the many things Soviet experts hid and twisted is that the ORM lower limit of 15 rods was not meant to prevent an insertion of positive reactivity. We point out once again, no report on Chernobyl mentions that the operators were supplied with an actual computer printout containing an ORM calculation after 1 AM on April 26, 1986, the ORM value on which, by all indications, was greater than 15 rods. The article authors point out that none of their listed actual violations influence the course of the disaster's development or the scale of its consequences, in some as well. Instead, the real causes of the Chernobyl disaster were in design and science, at the expert level. The brief list of real causes, crucially including the low quality of the operating instructions themselves, reminds us of the note on pages 83 and 84 of INSAG 7. Here we see an explicit mention of a lack of understanding, primarily on the part of the scientific managers, that cascaded through unsafe design. failure to account for alarming indications, and, quote, naturally to the formulation of incorrect operating procedures. Then a list of reasons is provided in an attempt to explain the inadequate level of scientific management, flipping Chernobyl on its head. It turns out that the biggest ignoramuses were not really the operators but the experts. The authors of these statements appears to be VP Volkov. We find his name somewhere else in INSAG 7. Let's read the top paragraph on page 60. Somewhat earlier, on 1st of May 1986, VP Volkov, head of the IV Kurchatov Institute research group on the reliability and safety of nuclear power plants with RBMK reactors, provided AP Alexandrov, director of the IV Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, and subsequently the leaders of the country, in a letter of 9th May 1986, with another version of the accident which attributed it not to the actions of the operating personnel, but to the design of the reactor core and the lack of proper understanding of the neutron physics processes going on in it. The version suggests that the accident was caused by a positive reactivity excursion following the insertion of the RCPS rods, as a result of their defective design and the large positive void coefficient of reactivity. So it was the head of RBMK safety research at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy who argued that the primary cause of the Chernobyl disaster was the ignorance, even willful ignorance, of his scientific colleagues, or perhaps scientific managers, rather than the actions of the operators. Then his colleagues, led publicly by Valery Legasov, who was first and foremost the manager, crafted the false narrative we have been exploring to deflect the blame onto the operators. The article authors make an allusion to yet another note we find in INSAG 7. This paragraph points out how, in another normal scenario of RBMK operation, a reactor could have been in similar circumstances. While we find the description here rather confusing, if you read the note on page 77 of INSAG 7, you can see such a situation being described in the report as well. The article authors write, many may ask, okay, the public is easy to deceive. Many are non-specialists. And here we arrive at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, commonly known as MIT, the premier technology institute in the United States. Associate Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering Michael P. Short. Dr. Short has not one but 2 BSs in Science and Engineering. And some of you may have seen his 3 million view lecture titled Chernobyl, How It Happened. Let's drop in for a few seconds.
What xenon-135 does is it just sits there. It's a noble gas. It has a half-life of a few days, so it decays on the slow side for, as fission products go.
According to nuclearpower.com, xenon-135 has a half-life of 9.2 hours, not a few days. It doesn't just sit there, its concentration changes substantially in 10 hours at constant power. This is why, as we have discussed a number of times previously, exactly when the power level of Chernobyl Reactor 4 was reduced to 50%, and for how long it was kept at 50%, throughout the 25th of April 1986, actually mattered a whole lot. Long story short, the extended power hold over the key of delay actually reduced the concentration of xenon and rebounded the number of control rods in the core.
The last part that this diagram doesn't mention is these control rods, and I'll draw this up here, were tipped with about 6 inches of graphite. So if these were 2 graphite channels, let's say these are carbon, and this is your control rod, the goal was to get this control rod all the way into the reactor. One part they didn't mention was they were tipped with about 6 inches of graphite.
We do not know how far down Michael P. Short looked for these 6-inch graphite displacers, but he certainly didn't look very deep. In actuality, the graphite displacers were measured in meters rather than inches, and their length of 4.5 meters was enough inches to skewer more women than we care to count. Also, the suggestive chalkboard drawing doesn't accurately represent that the graphite displacers were already fully submerged in the hot mess of the RBMK core and upon shutdown were trying to exit through the other end, which turned out as nasty as it sounds. What does the inability of even an MIT professor to get his RBMK sexual metaphors correct mean for the rest of us? Well, the article authors were pondering the very same question, more or less. They wrote off the public immediately. We're easy to deceive, but, quote, hundreds of foreign specialist experts were present at the IAEA meeting in August 1986. How could they agree with the conclusions of the Soviet delegation headed by academician V.A. Legasov? The answer to this question, the article authors inform us, is provided by excerpts from the report of the International Nuclear Safety Advisory Group, working on behalf of the International Atomic Energy Agency Director, otherwise known as INSAG-1. In that report, the authors praise Soviet nuclear power experts for their openness, only to proceed to drop the greatest hits of Soviet deception. For example, the RBMK power coefficient becomes positive under 700 megawatts, signifying the reactor being self-amplifying. Thus, the operating rules forbade continuous operation under 700 megawatts. We covered this topic in the steam effect and the false narrative 2 videos of this series. Then the article authors highlight the statement that the ORM minimum in operating instructions was 30 rods to ensure that the emergency protection shutdown system would work, which was also nonsense. While the key role of the emergency protection shutdown system, being an emergency initiation power-up system, went unmentioned. The article authors, personally familiar with the actual documents in question, having worked at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, categorically state that no documents prohibited operation at a power of less than 700 megawatts, or with an operating reactivity margin of under 30 rods. Not a single document mentioned a positive power coefficient of reactivity, signifying self-amplification, although some operators notably experienced it, for example in 1975 at Leningrad and in 1985 at Smolensk. These restrictions appeared only after the Chernobyl disaster, not before as Soviet nuclear power experts claimed. Thus, the well-prepared information fed to international experts was nothing more than a multifaceted lie. This elaborate lie has somehow morphed, adapted, and persisted to today. This is a matter of 6-inch lack of penetration. What happens is people lose sight of the forest for the trees. The individual trees get twisted in different shapes, distracting from how all of the mis- and disinformation started, preventing people from seeing the big picture. Incidentally, if you want to see a discussion on how the matter of the operators raising power after the drop to 30 megawatts, watch the How HBO Chernobyl Got It Wrong Mickey Mouse video. At the bottom of the article paragraph, we were reading, "There's a funny anecdote." Apparently at the trial of Chernobyl MPP officials and personnel, experts were asked why work at an ORM of under 15. Notice how the figure was divided in half, and a power of less than 700 megawatts was not called a nuclear hazardous mode in the regulations. The experts responded that they considered this being a nuclear hazardous area of operation only too obvious, lacking the need to be spelled out in regulations. Talk about assholes. To conclude, the article authors point out that when you combine all the false information and statements, when you add, for instance, the false claim regarding the water level and steam pressure protections being disabled, it becomes obvious that a false narrative was crafted to conceal or divert attention away from the true causes of the Chernobyl disaster. When the article authors were writing in 1990, they didn't have access to Politburo notes, to the statements of people Valery Legasov had confided in, to the recollections of the note-taker of the Chernobyl task force. We do. With time, the world moves on. Topics become less sensitive, and people start talking and writing about significant events of their pasts with greater actual openness. Who needed to hide the truth of Chernobyl were the people in power and of highest standing bearing responsibility for it. and the Soviet government with serious national interests at stake. As the famous Winston Churchill quote goes, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma. But perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest." The only way Soviet experts and the Soviet government could move on from this major disaster with a number of serious implications, including international ones, was to provide an explanatory narrative localizing the reasons for the disaster's occurrence. They reasoned this would enable them to move on from Chernobyl with minimized broader damage. But the article authors point out that one of the unintended long-term consequences of this campaign of lies was the undermining of nuclear energy. The extremely improbable confluence of circumstances that designers and scientists couldn't foresee, in reality nothing more than a cover for their asses, cast a pall on nuclear energy, not only domestically, but globally. The public's trust was heavily damaged. The lies of Chernobyl made strategic sense to those who shaped them and to those who condoned them. And there certainly was a personal component as well. But as is often the case, lies make strategic sense to people whose horizons aren't broad enough.